Today we're looking at Mark's Gospel, chapter 11 and 12. Now as we move into this section of Mark's Gospel, chapters 11 to 16, there is a significant change of pace. Chapters 1 to 10 moved rapidly from one event to the next. In chapters 11 to 16, the pace slows down, providing detailed information of the last week of Jesus' life. Jesus and his disciples left Jericho and walked 15 miles to Bethpage and Bethany, where he instructed 2 disciples to go into a village and tie a colt and bring it to him. Anyone who challenged them were to be told, "The Lord needs it and will send it back shortly." Everything turned out exactly as Jesus had said. We now celebrate this particular event on Palm Sunday, remembering Jesus rode triumphantly into Jerusalem, fulfilling Old Testament prophecy, which said, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion, shout, daughter Jerusalem, see your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." That's Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. It was a donkey, not a horse, expressing his humility and also his peaceful intentions. The disciples threw their garments on the donkey to make a makeshift saddle, and many people spread cloaks and branches on the road for him to ride down the slopes of the Mount of Olives. They rejoiced, crying out the words of Psalm 118, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The crowds were claiming Jesus as the promised Messiah. This was the first time Jesus had allowed himself to be publicly hailed as Messiah. When Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, he went to the temple courts, looked around, and assessed the priorities and values of the people working there. He then left with the disciples to walk the 2 miles to Bethany to stay the night. The next day, known as the Day of Authority, verses 12 to 19, would see Jesus do things that would have serious consequences. As they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. It only says Jesus, as presumably the disciples had eaten, but the Lord might have been in prayer and now knew and experienced hunger. He saw in the distance a fig tree in leaf. Foliage usually meant figs, not the main crop, but a sort of early, easily blown off the tree figs. But he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Jesus cursed it. "May no one ever eat fruit from you again," he said. This was not a fit of rage, but would later be used to teach a deeper spiritual lesson. Arriving in the temple, Jesus became a man of action and with strong determination drove out those who bought and sold, overturned the tables of money changers and the benches of those who sold doves. He stopped people using the temple courts as a shortcut and taught that it is written, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations," quoted from Isaiah 56:7, and then said, "But you have made it a den of thieves," taken from Jeremiah 7:11. This produced hostility from the religious leaders who wanted to kill him, but they feared to take action at that time. The next day has been called the Day of Questions, or the Day of Controversy, verses 20 to 33. They came to the fig tree, which was now completely dead. Peter said, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." This was Christ's only miracle of judgment. All other miracles were of blessing, and it was to teach an important lesson. Israel was that fig tree, because it had the leaves of religion, but no fruit of righteousness. Jesus used the cursed fig tree to teach about prayer. Prayer requires 2 characteristics to be effective: faith and forgiveness. He said, if you have faith in God, the God of the Bible, then we can say to this mountain, "Be removed and be cast into the sea," and it'll be done. This is not literally that we pray for Everest to be thrown into the Indian Ocean, Mountains are metaphorical here for barriers or obstacles to the will of God, which can only be removed by believing prayer. Jesus says in effect, you were impressed by the power that dried up a fig tree? Know the power of believing prayer which removes mountains. Yet it is impossible to pray effectively if our hearts are hard, bitter, and unforgiving towards others. The God of love wants communion from those who are willing to love. So effective prayer is about faith in God and showing forgiveness to people. In Jerusalem, Jesus was confronted with a question from the religious leaders. By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority to do these things? These things referred to what Jesus had done in the temple. They did not condemn the rightness of his actions, but wanted to trick him into saying something that could be used to destroy him. If he claimed divine authority, they would accuse him of blasphemy. If he claimed authority as a descendant of King David, they would accuse him of treason against Rome. If he disclaimed all authority, they would accuse him of being an impostor. Jesus replied with a question of his own. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or of men? Answer me. Verse 30. The religious leaders were pushed into a corner as Jesus took the issue to its roots. John had clearly pointed to Jesus as the promised Messiah. If they confirmed John had come from heaven and his message was from God, then obviously Jesus had his authority from God. They refused to say that John came from God, but were too afraid of the public to say that he was not a prophet of God, and said, we don't know. Jesus then refused to answer their question, at least in a direct way. Instead, he answered it completely through the parable of the son's rejection in chapter 12, verses 1 to 12. This parable says a man planted a vineyard with a defensive wall, a winepress, and a watchtower. Tenants rented the vineyard. Now, this was a familiar imagery, as in the Old Testament, Israel is described as a vineyard. Isaiah 5, 1 to 7 says, My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are the garden of his delight. So Jesus was talking about Israel, and this is a historical parable. A servant was sent to collect the rent, but was beaten. Others were stoned, wounded, or killed. There was no rent for the owner. God, of course, had sent prophets to encourage fruitfulness amongst his people as he looked for obedience, righteousness, justice, compassion, patience, and holiness. The prophets were cruelly treated, even killed, but we see a picture of God's continuing patience as more servants are sent. But it does come to an end. Remarkably, Jesus introduces himself into his own story. It says, verse 6, Having yet therefore one son, his well-beloved, he sent him also last unto them, saying, They will reverence my son. Amazingly, after all that had gone before, the owner was willing to risk his son. There is no missing Jesus' implication that he was saying, I am that son. The son is killed. And so what would the owner of the vineyard do? He would destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. So here was prophecy by Jesus. He would die at the hands of the tenants, the religious leaders of Israel. The tenants themselves would be destroyed, which happened, of course, in the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Romans. Other tenants, the Gentile nations, would enjoy the spiritual blessings of the gospel. The imagery then changes from tenant farmers to builders. A stone rejected and discarded was made the head of the corner, the most important stone in the building. Only God could take what was rejected and give it the place of supreme honour. And to quote the psalmist, this is marvellous in our eyes. Jesus was that stone, rejected, mocked, humiliated, tortured, and crucified for our sins, buried as the cursed one who hung on a cross. But God raised him to life on the third day, and then he ascended to the glorious place at the Father's right side. The reaction of the religious leaders was hostility, as they knew they were the tenants. They did not seize Jesus then and there, as he was so popular with the crowd, but they left him and went away to plot his death. What followed were some serious questions in chapter 12, verses 13 to 27. From the Pharisees, a religious party, from the Herodians, a political party, and from the Sadducees, the ruling party. These disparate groups had one common aim: the elimination of Jesus. The first question aimed to catch him in his words, says verse 13. The word catch is a hunting term and means to entrap. Firstly, they used flattery, describing Jesus as a man of integrity, of settled conviction, and who taught the way of God. Then came the question: is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Should we pay or not? If Jesus said yes, pay taxes, he would be seen as condoning the Roman oppressors. If he said no, don't pay taxes, then he would be in trouble with the Roman authorities, who would consider him a troublemaking rebel. Jesus saw through their hypocrisy and answered by asking for a coin. If the questioners produced a coin, it implied that they had accepted imperial Roman coinage and therefore Roman authority. Jesus looked at the coin and asked whose superscription was on it. They said Caesar's. Jesus replied with a masterstroke: give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Verse 17. The people gasped with amazement. The second question came from the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection. Verse 18. The Old Testament, Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 10, decreed that a man who died with no offspring should expect his brother to marry the widow and raise up the first child in his name. The question involved a probable fictional account of a woman who married in turn 7 brothers as each died. There were no children, and then the woman herself died. The question is this: whose wife would she be in the resurrection? Jesus points out that the Sadducees were wrong in 2 ways. Firstly, they did not understand the scriptures, and secondly, they did not appreciate the power of God to raise the dead. Jesus then went on to explain that physical relationships between men and women are for this life only. Life in the next world is not a repetition of life here on earth. Then he quoted the book of Exodus with the words I am, which is present tense, not the past tense, as he spoke of God being the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had been dead for hundreds of years when God spoke to Moses from the burning bush and used I am, used in other words the present tense. God, he says, is not the God of dead people, but of the living. So the souls of the patriarchs had lived on after physical death in the presence of God. So of course there will be a general resurrection. The next question had to do with the commandments and was different from the previous questions. Firstly, it is asked by an individual and not a group of people, and secondly, it seems to be genuine and not designed to trick. One of the teachers of the law came to an obvious conclusion: that Jesus had given good answers and said, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The Lord's reply could be summarized with one word: love. We should look up and love God, and we should look outward and love people. He quoted the Old Testament twice. Firstly, from Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. This verse was the foundation of Jewish faith, indicating we should love God with the totality of our being, emotionally with all our heart, spiritually with all our soul, intellectually with all our mind, and physically with all our strength. Love for God means obedience to his laws and doing his will. The second quotation rather than question is love your neighbour as yourself, Leviticus 19:18, and implies that love for God is reflected in our love for those in need. The teacher reflected on the answer and said, "Well said, teacher." Everything Jesus had said was correct. He then said, "God is one and there is no other but him," and then agreed that we should love God and our neighbour as ourselves. Finally said that this is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. This teacher complimented Jesus. Then came the shock, even horror and terror. The teacher of the law had been appraising the Lord and appraising his answer, but quickly found out that the Lord had been quietly appraising him. He had wanted to examine and sit in judgment upon Jesus, but Jesus had been examining and judging him. What did Jesus see? He saw wisdom. He had answered wisely or intelligently, and he said, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." In other words, you are on the right track and close to coming into God's kingdom. This incident ended the questions, and from then on no one dared ask him any more questions. In the next verses, Jesus asked questions, and the large crowd listened to him with delight. Verse 37. Jesus went from defense to attack as he asked, "Why do the teachers of the law say that the Messiah is the son of David?" Jesus was not saying that they were wrong, simply that they did not have the full picture. The promised Messiah was surely a descendant of Israel's greatest ruler, King David. Jesus then quoted Psalm 110 verse 1, written by David. "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet." Why did David call him my Lord instead of my son or my descendant? The answer is that both are true. The Messiah was, humanly speaking, a son of David, but was also pre-existent to David. He was the Son of Man and also the Son of God who chose to enter the human race. Jesus was implying that the Messiah is greater than David, because David calls him not my son, but my Lord. Our blessed Lord was earlier than David as Son of God, and yet later than David as Son of Man. As Jesus continued to teach, he said, "Watch out, or beware of the teachers of the law." We can imagine heads turning and all eyes focusing upon a group of teachers of the law, and maybe Jesus pointing at them. Now, not all teachers of the law were equally bad, but they claimed to serve God. But their lack of faithfulness would lead to the severest condemnation. Their problems were that they were proud of their status, wearing special, long, distinctive robes. They loved to be popular, as people respectfully stepped aside for them. They loved prominence in the most visible seats in the synagogues, and they loved priority with the best seats at feasts. They loved possessions and even exploited widows, loved making long public prayers to impress the listeners. Jesus publicly exposed the pride, greed and hypocrisy, saying, "In the end they will be punished most severely." Let us remember that God looks on the heart and knows exactly what we are really like. Chapter 12 ends with a little incident told in less than 100 words involving an unnamed, unknown widow who sacrificed to God and warmed his heart. Here was a woman who honoured God not only in her living, but in her giving. The court of the women in the temple was not exclusively for women, but was the furthest into the temple complex they were allowed to go. There were 13 copper collecting boxes, trumpet-shaped at the top, through which the coins were dropped. The more one put in, the more noise was created, and could all too easily draw attention to one's generosity. Jesus watched with supreme indifference the many rich people who threw in large amounts. Then he saw a poor widow woman. Women were considered second class in those days, with few legal rights. A widow could easily be neglected or exploited, and all this widow could give were 2 of the smallest of all the Jewish coins. Jesus drew the attention of his disciples to the widow who was disappearing, and said that she had given more than all the others. He knew her motive, which was generosity towards God. He knew that she gave sacrificially, because she gave everything, all she had to live on. This widow gave more because the others gave their little to God and kept back much, while she gave all to God. Giving is usually a good indicator of our spiritual state or condition. True giving is a response of loving thanksgiving to the one who saved us. God bless you.